Seeking profits and increasing shareholder equity is a legal mandate under American law. All right? Now, I'm going to come back in a moment to why that makes so much nonsense of a lot of people who think that you can have socially responsible corporations. You can't, under the law, because increasing shareholder equity is legally mandated in American law. Now, this process wasn't completely straightforward. All right? In 1906, the Supreme Court ruled in Hale versus Hinkle that the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures applied to corporations, but that the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination didn't. In 1950, in U.S., I love this one, U.S. versus Morton Salt. Okay, you know, the one that has the girl with the umbrella, okay, the Morton Salt canister. U.S. versus Morton Salt. The power of the government was brought against that poor girl. U.S. versus Morton Salt. The court ruled that corporations can claim no equality with individuals about privacy because they possess, quote, public attributes that have a collective impact on society. In other words, you've got a pretty incoherent mismatch of legal decisions about what exactly constitutes the legal nature of the corporation. But since the 1960s, the Supremes have pretty much given up on theorizing about corporate personhood, and have pretty much been giving ever more generous protections to corporate persons under the law. Now, legal theorists and philosophers were very clear that the courts were creating really unprecedented and strange rights for corporations. There's one corporate theorist who was writing in the Harvard Law Review in 1911, and he said that one, quote, had to pierce the veil of corporate entity in order to see the human beings who are behind the entity. He still conceded that this new kind of entity was simply an association, was not simply an association of shareholders, but, quote, recognized and treated by the law as something distinct from its members. In other words, the corporation's existence as a legal person is an example of what Marx called fetishism, or of what Weber would call enchantment, or of what a theologian might call a doctrine of the church. In fact, the literary critic Kenneth Burke said this in 1937 when he said that the corporation had inherited from the medieval church, quote, the unwieldy mysticism of the corpus mysticum, the mystical body of business. Now, the emergence of this corporate personhood didn't go unchallenged. The legal construction of corporate personality in the late 19th and early 20th centuries took place at the same time that other movements, like labor unions, socialists, anarchists, populists, and progressives, were also attempting to harness the possibilities generated by modern capitalism. And most, if not all of these groups were alarmed by the new ideas of corporate personhood. Socialists and populists, in particular, noted that this whole edifice of corporate law, which was being constructed, was basically using the old proprietary language to shield corporations from legal and political challenge, and to protect a basically unelected government of capital and management from any sort of dissent. So, but progressives, in other words, by the way, the ancestors of what we would call today modern liberals, the capital P progressives, they saw some of these legal and economic entities, these corporations, as actually steps toward a more humane order. All right? They hoped that this older conception of the corporations as public institutions, right, the one that was talked about in the Pennsylvania legislature, could be revived and applied to a new industrial order. It's useful to be reminded at this point that corporate personality then defined the terrain of subsequent political and economic life, all the way down to the present. Much of the atrophy of left-wing radicalism in this country can be traced to its inability to deal with the fact of corporate personhood. Notice, for example, the emergence of the modern welfare state as the centerpiece of the liberal tradition, right, stems from the liberal tradition's acceptance of the corporation, which should belie, by the way, all notions about alleged liberal hostility to business. And much of conservatism, what we call conservatism, evolved into a defense of an institution that violates every traditional proprietary nostrum about ownership and moral responsibility. If you are a genuine conservative, you should hate corporations. Hate them. Moreover, the defense of corporate personhood shaped judicial interpretations of the 14th Amendment in such a way that racial minorities were excluded from the canopy. In 1938, Justice Hugo Black observed that of all the 14th Amendment Supreme Court cases since the Santa Clara decision, so from 1886 to 1938, quote, less than 0.5% invoked it in protection of the Negro race, and more than 50% asked that its benefits be extended to corporations, end quote. So consider some of the things that, as Lewis Carroll might say, are curiouser and curiouser about the modern corporation. Take that legal fiction of shareholder primacy. However generous stockholders can be as individuals, I'm sure they're very nice people, they pet their dogs, they play with their kids, they give informed attention to the arts, and they help out at soup kitchens. However generous they might be as individuals, stockholders are absent, passive, and largely unproductive body of speculators whose sole activity is the extraction of wealth. Shareholders do not provide most of the capital for modern corporations. That is one of the best hidden secrets in the business school. Most capital for modern corporations comes from retained earnings, not shareholders. So don't believe a word when any shareholder might say to you, I am providing capital for the enterprise of this company. You're not. You're not. In the world of flesh and blood and stagnant wages, the corporation is a community of persons who make things and meet human needs. The fiction, therefore, of corporate personhood is as pernicious as it is breathtaking. Legal theorists have noticed this themselves. I'll quote an indispensable 1967 book, Legal Fictions, right? If you go to law school and you study corporate law, you will read this book. Legal Fictions. Lon Fuller states, quote, the strangeness and boldness of the legal fiction has tended to stifle layman's criticisms. That's not a Marxist. That's not an anarchist. That is a law professor. John Lubin of the Wharton School. The Wharton School, again, not a haven of anarchists. John Lubin of the Wharton School observed that, quote, it is unrealistic to manage the affairs of a company as specified in most legal statutes, for the board simply cannot perform the functions required. It is just as unrealistic to expect the board to be a policy-making body and to really participate in strategy-making functions, which is a way of saying corporate boards don't mean anything. And speaking legally, the stockholders both own and are the corporation, yet they cannot be held personally responsible for its actions. They own a person, which means they can sell it, which raises curious questions about the meaning of the 13th Amendment, which prohibits involuntary servitude. The status of employees raises similar conundrums. If a corporation can be bought and sold, aren't employees bought and sold? But if the employees are not part of the corporation, which as property is a commodity, while it's also a person, then what exactly is their legal status? It would seem that workers are part of the property. And so when companies cheerfully proclaim in their public relations that, quote, our employees are our greatest assets, you should think about that. Because the smiley face, get past the smiley face and recall that assets are things that are owned. As parts of the property and within the legal framework of the corporation, employees have no due process, no right to privacy, no protections against unreasonable search and seizure, no free speech. a right to which I might add is protected for corporations. Police need a court order to do what corporations are allowed to do every day. Install cameras, monitor computers, tape conversations, examine your urine.